difficult because that's not what we thought it meant. And all of a sudden, we're confronted with something that we stand condemned. We stand before God with guilt, where before we thought we had none. If you think about the idea of being difficult to hear, if you remember on the day of Pentecost when Peter and the rest of the apostles preached that gospel sermon, was that difficult for those people to hear? Oh, man, yeah. It says they were pricked in their hearts. And that idea, I always was wondering about that phraseology, that being pricked in their hearts. But, you know, when you've got when you have a long-standing belief, and you just know in your heart that you're right, and you realize you're confronted with truth. And remember, these people had never been confronted with truth. They had believed something. They had believed the lies of their leaders, and they believed that Jesus was this heretic. I mean, he was an apostate. He was wrong-headed. He was blasphemous. And then when they proceeded to preach in really easily understandable terms exactly what the problem was, and they were pricked in their hearts. And then they said, "Men and brethren, what shall we do?" And then Peter tells them what they need to do. And at this point, they knew what they had done. They had convicted, they had basically tried, convicted, and put the Son of God to death, where he was blameless and he was sent for their edification and for their spiritual growth, and they disregarded him. Okay? So the idea of having difficult passages is not new. There have been people we've chewed over the Bible. It's probably the most studied book ever, because people study it even if they don't believe in it. They still study it. They still look at it. It's one of the most quoted books ever. But it doesn't change the fact that there's sometimes some verses, some passages where we look at them and we think, okay, I kind of get this, but it doesn't follow through with what else we know. So where do we go from here? How do we figure this out? So this is what we're talking about. And I'm mainly saying this for the folks who might be joining us through YouTube, because we might hit a passage that you always thought you knew what it meant, but you were mistaken, you were misled. So I want to make sure we understand that. All right, Proverbs 22 and verse 6. Somebody read that for me. What does it say? You know it by heart. If I started it, you could probably finish it. Okay. How many times have we heard this? Have you heard it 100 times? 200 times? 300? Probably. There's no telling how many times we've heard of this. What is the mindset almost always when we hear this? What is the setting for most of the situations in which we hear this verse? What's being discussed? The idea of discipline, right? You know, it's one of the verses. It's like a go-to verse when we want to talk about how we as Christians, and maybe just we as human beings, ought to train up our children and discipline our children, to keep our children under submission. Not the idea of reigning it over them like a tyrant, but the idea of them submitting to our authority as we submit to God's authority. Okay, so that makes perfect sense. And most of the time, when we hear this, what's the consensus in regards to what does this verse mean? Okay, is that what most people hear? Okay, if you train up a child in the way he should go, when he's old, now not old, but older, when he gets maybe of the age of majority, if we look at this on face value, it says if you train him up in the way he should go, when he's old enough to even make his own decisions, so to speak, he won't leave the faith. Does that make perfect? We're going to get to that. We're going to talk about that because we've got to discuss that. It's important that we discuss what's going on here. So let's look at this, because I know because you're probably the 100th person that said that exact same thing. What she said, it's the idea that how many times have I asked myself, did I do everything that I need to do? Was I the kind of parent? Did I behave? Did I instruct? Yep. Okay. How did I fail? How did I fail? What did I do wrong? We're going to talk about that, because I don't know how many saints have worried and fretted and wept and mourned the idea that somehow they have failed as parents because their children have decided to go elsewhere and do something different. But we're going to talk about that because we've got to address that issue. All right. Now, I want to preface this by saying the traditional understanding regarding this proverb. This is a proverb. Now, we've got to remember Proverbs. Proverbs are wise sayings. Before anything else, they are simply wise sayings. Does that mean that every proverb is always, in 100% of the cases, true? No, of course not. It says that a man with white hair has wisdom? Do all men with white hair have wisdom? I've seen some very foolish, white-headed old men. Okay, they say foolish things and they do foolish things. So that is it's not some guarantee that because you are old enough to have white hair. What about folks who are bald? You know, does that mean that if you're bald you don't have any wisdom? Well, no, that's equally that's equally as ridiculous. Okay, so we got to remember this: that a proverb is simply that, is a wise saying that in most cases is pretty accurate. Okay, so that's number one. Also, we need to remember that the traditional interpretation of this verse, or the traditional thinking in regards to this verse, is based on a false interpretation of a correct translation. And I'm going to write this down. I want to make sure I phrase this correctly. A false interpretation of a correct translation. All right. So in regards to this verse, a lot of times we think, okay, it's talking about the idea of discipline. So let's look a little bit. Does God consider discipline to be a good thing? I mean, is he generally in favor of discipline? Good discipline, because there are such things as bad discipline, right? You know, there are ways that you train a dog, right? That are sometimes, some of them are good, some of them are bad. The thing about it is, with a dog, we're looking at end result. We're not looking at, are we harming their psyche, right? You know, we want the dog to do what we want the dog to do. We don't want the dog to go to the bathroom in the house. Now, some people say, well, I'm going to take him outside, and I'm going to teach him, and I'm going to do all of this kind of stuff. Some people's idea of disciplining the dog is when they find the dog has made a mess on the floor, take a rolled up newspaper, and they just need to whack the dog. We're going to beat the dog about the head and the shoulders, and to them, they're disciplining the dog. But are they? No, it's not really accomplishing anything. Dogs are dogs. They don't understand. They're not even thinking about the mess on the floor anymore. They're just wondering, why is this person hitting me? They're shying away. And pretty soon you've got a dog that's not only not trained to not go in the house, but they're also trained to think that when my owner comes home, I'm going to get a beating. Okay, so the idea of discipline is not always that of correct discipline. But let's look at what God has to say about discipline, because this is important. Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 5. Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 5. Whoever's got that one, raise your hand, and we'll go to the next one. I've got about 2 or 3 verses that I want to go into. Deuteronomy 8 and verse 5. Who wants to read that for me? All right, Miss Sybil, you read that one? Proverbs 13, verse 24. Who wants to read Proverbs 13, 24? Brother William? All right. Proverbs 29 and verse 17. All right, Jerome, you got that one? And then Proverbs 22 and verse 15. All right, Dad, you read that one. All right, so first, let's do Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 5, Miss Sybil. Okay. All right, so what can we get from this verse? It says, what's that start out again? The man chastens his son, the Lord your God chastens you. All right, that word chastens is simply another translation of the word that means discipline. Okay, so we look at that, and it says, know then in your hearts. So that's important. So we know then when a child, when a child is being disciplined, do they always look at it in the way that we want them to look at it? How many times have you had to say, I'm doing this because I love you? The kid doesn't understand that yet. They just think mom and dad are mad at them. A lot of times that's why they won't fess up. Mom and dad are mad. They don't say anything. But when you get a little bit older, you realize the reason mom and dad were so hard on me is because they love me. They didn't want me to do stupid things. They didn't want me to do things that would cost me my life or my reputation or something else. So he wants us to understand, know in your hearts. He's not saying, do you know in your hearts? He's saying that's what we need to be doing. We need to know in our hearts. It's an imperative. You've got to know in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Why does the Lord God discipline us? Why does He discipline us? He loves us. But there's something more to it than that. It's not simply because He loves us. He loves us so that He wants what? Obedience. He wants He wants what's best for us. He wants something for us that sometimes we don't even know we need for ourselves, doesn't He? All right. He wants us to. He doesn't want us to perish. He wants us to repent. He wants us to live with Him for eternity. We look at ourselves and we think, why would He want me? Or even more so, why does He want that guy? Why would He want him? I know what he's like. But we need to know in our hearts that as we love our children, and if we love them, we discipline them, then the Lord our God does the same thing for us. And it's important. Because if we were left to our own devices, where would we be? Oh yeah, by far. And I want you to remember that. If He let us do what we wanted to do, where would we be? I want you to remember that phraseology here in just a couple minutes. Okay? So know in your hearts that as a man disciplines his son because he loves him, that the Lord our God disciplines you. All right, Proverbs 13, verse 24. Who's got that? All right. Okay. So where are we get on this one? What is this verse telling us? He who spares the rod hates his son. Okay? The idea of discipline and love go hand in hand. And see, that's another thing that we need to remember. The idea of love and discipline it's basically a hand inside of a glove. Okay? They fit well together. Okay. Let's continue on with this one. The second part of this kind of refers back to the first part of it. He who loves him is diligent to discipline him, or disciplines him promptly. Okay, you don't let something go. You don't let something go and go to it later on. You immediately do it, right? If a child is disobedient, you don't wait a week to discipline them. You do it immediately so that they understand, especially a small child. They get the idea of having it's immediate, it's prompt. Okay. So they know the behavior that they've engaged in is wrong, whether it's sinful or not. It's wrong. It's a bad thing to do, and they know it immediately. All right. So, and then the inverse is true as well, right? Whoever spares the rod, who doesn't discipline their child and son and child, daughter, it's all interchangeable. He who spares the rod does what to his son? Is he doing him any favor? Okay. Can we behave in such a way that we feel that we're doing best for our children when in fact we're not doing the best for our children? You look at the way society is now. We want to excuse everything. Teacher gets on to our kid. What's the first thing mom and dad do? Heather could tell you these stories. She'd discipline a child, and sure enough, there'd be the principal would call her into the office, and mom and dad are there, and they lay into her for disciplining a child for acting badly in the classroom. And mom and dad are just furious that she would have the temerity to discipline their child who was behaving badly. And she couldn't make them understand, I've got better things to do than to be unfair to a child. Okay? But there's the concept. My child couldn't do that. My child would never. It wasn't him. You're just doing this because you hate him or whatever it might be. These people feel, I think on a very deep level, that to show love to a child means that of necessity you must excuse any kind of behavior that they engage in, no matter what it is. And we find that actually through Scripture, don't we? Think about David and Absalom. Did David love Absalom? Did he love Absalom? Scripture tells us. Now this idea, we got to remember this. The word hate here does not connote what we typically think of when we think of hate. It does not mean that we despise, we reject, we do anything like that. It simply means we are not engaging in the kind of behavior that would connote love. Because if we love them, we discipline them, right? If you love them in the way that they need to be loved, okay. Sometimes I'm embarrassed by their behavior, so I'm going to make sure that everybody knows it wasn't really them. You know, I'm mainly looking out for myself. I don't want my reputation to be damaged by my child, so I'm going to take up for whatever nonsense that they're involved in. You know, I'm going to excuse anything they do. If they get in trouble, it's somebody else's fault. It's never theirs. Because that would be embarrassing to me to realize and for everyone to know that my child is poorly behaved. So I'm going to make sure everybody knows that it wasn't them. It was the teacher, the principal, the coach, the classmate, the whatever. It's their fault. All right? But it says, Scripture tells us, that if we spare the rod, then we don't love our children. At least not love them in the way that they need to be loved. Okay? All right, so let's continue on. Proverbs 29, verse 17. Okay. What do we get from this? Isn't it great to have a child that is obedient, that listens, that does what you tell them to? Has anybody ever had one? That never gave a moment of worry or doubt or fear. They never once said no or later or, I can't wait until I get out of here and live my own life and I won't treat my children the way you treat. Has anybody ever had a child like that? Yeah, well, that's because grandparents are myopic. Grandbabies never do anything wrong. No. But the idea here is he's telling it that discipline in the younger years leads to what in the older years? What does it say? It says, discipline your son and he will do what? He will give you rest. I'm just looking, what does the verse say? If you discipline your child, he will give you rest. So now what is he saying here? And he's not simply saying that son or daughter is going to take care of you. He's saying that you're not going to have to worry about worry about your children running wild. You're not going to have to worry about running rampant and behaving badly and causing stress and distress in your life. Okay? Now this one leads us up to the next one. And we'll go to 22 verse 15. I'm going to read this one really quickly. God saw this so well, and he saw it so intensely that he gives them this command. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, in verses 18 through 21, it tells us this. It says this, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son, it's interesting that he usually goes with son, but the idea here is that children, okay, a child. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, will not listen to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gate of the place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of this city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear. God saw discipline as a fairly important thing. Why? Because no discipline, poor discipline, or rebellion against discipline leads to what? What does it say? What? Yeah, true. In society, we've certainly seen that, haven't we? But in this context, what did this lead to on the part of the young person? They died. The command was to take their life because he is rebellious, he is stubborn, he is a drunkard and a glutton. He will not listen to us. He will not obey our voice. And it says they are to take. Now, I don't know how many parents actually took advantage of this little law. I don't know too many people are going to take their son and take him out to the city gates, but God provided for that. He said, because look how he describes it. He says, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. So even God said that rebellion against authority and against discipline is evil. And this was something that he provided for the nation of Israel through their parents. Any type of group of people who have rejected the authority of their parents, provided that there was any authority coming from parents. Because oftentimes there's not any authority coming from parents. And that's the sad thing about it. A lot of people are rebelling against something that's not even there. There is no parental involvement. There is no parental concern for their well-being. And when there is, it's a misplaced one. Have nothing to do with your kids. Allow them to do whatever they want. And then when they finally get into trouble, blame everybody but themselves and their child. It's always somebody else's fault. But here he's providing for that. He says, my nation, you, my people, are not going to be this way. This is the remedy that I'm providing. So this gets down to Proverbs 22 and verse 15, Deb. Go ahead. Okay. Now, why did he feel that he needed to produce that law in Deuteronomy? Because what is it about the heart of a child? Foolishness. Some translations say folly, which is the same thing. Folly and foolishness. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. Interesting. So when we look at kids and we think, who am I going to believe if an adult comes to me and says that my child was behaving badly, Am I going to believe the adult that has nothing at stake in this, or am I going to believe my child that will tell me anything to avoid punishment? Which one are you going to believe? I love my children, but if an adult came to me and said, I just wanted to tell you something, your girls were involved, or your daughter was saying this or doing this, you better believe I'm going to listen to what they have to say, and I'm going to deal with the situation. I'm certainly not going to say immediately, well, no, they would never do that. How dangerous is it to say your child will never do something? Well, it says here, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. Yeah. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. No, if I'd gotten a whipping at school, I would never tell mom and dad about it. Yeah, you get one at home, you get one at school, you're going to get a worse one when you get home. But, here he gives this law, he gives this commandment in Deuteronomy, and the reason he did it was because in Proverbs it says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. Okay? And this is what happens. So the reason I want to look at this is because when we talk about this, I want to make sure that we understand with the idea of how important discipline is to God. Even today, He disciplines us. And as a matter of fact, we should encourage that. We should embrace that discipline. We cannot be pleasing to God if we don't allow God to make us into pleasing individuals. He's the one that disciplines us. Punishment has a portion of it. It's not all of it. Well, if we look, a lot of times we conflate the two, and they don't need to be conflated. They certainly go hand in hand. But the idea, going back to the idea of discipline, of trying to discipline a dog, to discipline a dog, part of the idea of disciplining a dog, say for example, you want them to learn to walk on a lead. Okay, you got a leash. So what do? Do you beat them until they go and put the leash on and then walk around? No. You teach them. You let them expect the leash. You know what's going on. Sometimes I was always told that you put the leash on, then you let them. They'll run around with it for a little bit. Don't know what this thing is around. Pretty soon they accept it. Like, okay, this is around my neck. I might as well get used to the fact that now this is around my neck. Then they learn to walk, and pretty soon you can have a dog that can go without a leash simply because you've trained them in the correct way. You've disciplined them. And that's the idea of discipline. It's the idea of training. It's a constant, steady thing. We were disciplined as children. We were trained up as a child. It says, train up a child in the way you should go, right? Train up a child in the way you should go. All right. So, but punishment is after the fact. When you're punishing them, it's a little too late for the idea of discipline. At this time, it's punishment. It's the stoning of that young man was not discipline, was it? That was punishment for rejecting discipline. All right. And we got to be very careful, because are we going to be punished for rejecting discipline? As Christians, will we be punished for rejecting discipline? Yeah, absolutely. It's an eternal punishment, folks. It's not something that the time for discipline is over. Now is the time for punishment. All right, so we got that out of the way. I wanted to kind of talk about that because in regards to this verse, we have to be very careful that we don't misuse it. We have to understand that discipline is at the heart of this verse of Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6. All right. So let's continue on. So let's look at some different trains of thought. Oh, I wanted to write these up here in case somebody's watching and they want to. Verse 17 and Proverbs 22, verse 15. Okay, those are the verses. I want to make sure we kept those up there. All right, so then we've got some different trains of thought when it comes to this verse, Proverbs 22 and verse 6. All right, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. So here's some questions. Does it mean that if parents do everything right, and teach everything right, and do everything right, that their children will never depart? Mm-hmm. Right. Right. We have to look at God's word. We know God's word is always correct. So the verse is always correct. All right. The verse is always correct. Now, I want to make sure we understand this. Remember, this is a wise saying. It's not something that's 100% all of the time. It's simply that it's a proverb. Okay. All it is a wise saying that's true most of the time. There are always exceptions to the rule, but we have to remember this. First, we have to remember this, that God has never and never will usurp someone's free will. Will He? Okay? We have complete and total free will as to whether we will obey or disobey. Children have a choice whether they're going to obey or disobey mom and dad's command, right? We can't force them to do what we want them to do. All we can merely do is instruct them, and when they don't do it, we punish them. And sometimes that punishment can take ever-increasing degrees, right? First you start out, with a small child, you sit them down and you get their attention, you say, no, don't do that. And then pretty soon it graduates a little bit, and then pretty soon you maybe take a belt to them. Then sometimes you get to the point where you start taking away privileges. And it goes on and on and on. And of course in society, the final thing for society is, of course, taking their life at the end of the day. That's the ultimate punishment that society can dole out for someone who refuses to accept correction, right? Take something away that's important to them, right? When we try to discipline adult members of our society, we take away their freedom, don't we? We lock them up in a place. You can't behave the way you need to behave in public, therefore we're going to take your freedom away from you. You're going to have to sit there in the old time words, you sit there and think about it for a while. 10 to 15 years, maybe, whatever it might be. But we've got to remember that God never usurps our free will. He always has allowed us to say and do what we want to do, but we will not escape the consequences of that. Same thing with when we rebuke our children, when we discipline our children. All we can do really at the end of the day is try our very best to train them, and then when they refuse to do that is punish it when it's necessary to be punished. All right? So if God has never usurped personal free will, then what makes us think that He would delegate that to human parents? I won't take away your free will, but mom and dad can take away your free will. No, we can't do that either. If God's not going to do it, He's certainly not going to delegate that position to us. As a matter of fact, if anybody needs to take away free will, it needs to be God, because God has a pattern. So if anybody's going to take away free will, it needs to be God, not mom and dad. But since He doesn't do it, then He certainly hasn't given that for us to do. So the idea here that if we do everything right and teach everything right, that our children will never depart is just it's unbelievable to think that somehow that if we say everything and do everything correctly, that our children will magically never leave their faith. It's just unbelievable for us to think that. It doesn't make any sense. All right. So, and I guarantee you, everybody here has known parents who have done everything they know. They've taught everything they know. They've lived their lives as Christians, example, and yet their children still fall away. Everybody here knows somebody like that. Okay. So, so that interpretation can't quite be correct. That first interpretation can't quite be correct. All right. Now, some people feel that if the child departs, then the verse also still rings true, that if the child departs, then somehow mom and dad didn't do what they were supposed to do. They failed their child on some level. Now, does that mean that a parent is responsible for never erring in anything they ever do? That's placing an unreasonable expectation on mom and dad, isn't it? Mom and dad can never make a mistake. Well, guess what? That doesn't work either, because mom and dads, we make mistakes. We say something maybe that we shouldn't say, or we don't handle something the exact right way. But God doesn't look at that and say, well, you made a mistake. You made this little small mistake 15 years ago. You said something not quite right, and therefore, you see how your child is not in the church anymore? That's on you. That's your responsibility. You made the mistake. Does that make sense either? That's not reasonable. And God would be unreasonable to expect that from us. Okay, we've looked through history, and we see people who have lived their lives correctly, and yet their children still made mistakes, made error. Okay, all right. So we know that cannot be correct. It condemns the parent for the failure of the child. All right, and we know that God doesn't do that. Our failure is our own failure. All right. At the end of the day, even if we made a huge mistake and our children left the faith, it's still their responsibility. It's still on them to come back and make it right, or to fall away, never fall away in the first place. All right. So no, that's incorrect. Some people look at the verse and they say that while the child may lead the faith, because of this text. Now, this is really straining at the text. This is really wresting the text. That if they leave the faith because of this text, because of the way this text is supposed to be read, that he will surely return before his death. That if he falls away, then he will, because of this text, because of the way this text needs to be read, we know that they will return before their death, before it's everlasting too late. Now, does that make sense? Has anyone here ever known someone who died outside of Christ, but they were raised in the church? Oh man, off the top of my head, I could give you 10 names of people I know who died outside of the Lord while they were raised, quote unquote, raised in the church. Okay, so we know that translation of that verse doesn't quite work either. All right, so those are three very incorrect misinterpretations of 22 and verse 5. All right, so or 22 and verse 6. That's what we're going to talk about. All right, so let's look at this. The key to this verse that we need to remember is the phrase, the way he should go. All right. Now see, that's the word that's giving us fits, isn't it? The way he should go. Now when we think of the word should means what? Yeah. The way that they are supposed to, the way they ought to go, the way that they've been trained to go, the way everything that we understand about the word ought leads us to the understanding that if you train up a child in the way he ought to go, then when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, on the surface, that makes perfect sense. I mean, that's the way we understand. I mean, that's just basic English, isn't it? Okay, here's the problem. Here's the problem. The problem is not translating the original Hebrew to English. Okay, the problem is not in the interpretation of the word that's in Hebrew to the word English ought. The problem is in the misinterpretation of British English versus American English. And see, what I'm about to tell you makes this verse make a whole lot more sense. All right? In American English, should becomes ought to. Makes sense, right? Hey, you ought to go out and roll up your windows because it's about to rain. Well, that makes sense, right? I ought to. Yeah, I ought to. I should go out there and roll up my windows because it's about to rain. I don't want my car to get wet, or put my top up because I don't want my car to get wet. Hey, you ought to have some of these. You ought to have some of this casserole because it's really good. Well, that makes sense. I ought to means I should have some of this, and I might take you up on that because it looks real good, and it looks like it would taste good, and I know who made it, and they always make good food. When we think about that word ought to, we as American people, in our understanding of the English language, we look at the word ought to, and we see, our minds automatically translate that to should. Okay? Is everybody in agreement with that? Does that make sense? Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Okay. In American English, should means ought to, that's what we do with this verse. But in Old English, should means would like to. Means would like to. Okay. It doesn't mean that he ought to, but that he wants to. Now, read that verse again with that understanding of the word should. Somebody read it. Okay, now think about that for just a second. You had your hand up, brother. No. That's what I'm saying. We're looking at in American English, the way that we as Americans read that word. We look at should as we ought to. We ought to do that. This is Old English. This is before the American English, because in American English, that's what we understand the word should to mean. I should do this because I ought to do this. And if we translate that, the way he ought to go, train up a child in the way he ought to go, when he's old, he will not depart from it. The problem is when we translated it from Old English into New English, we have a misunderstanding about the word ought to. Now I want you to read that again. Now read it with authority. Now think about that translation for just a second. Train up a child in the way he would like to go And when he's old, he won't depart from it. That makes sense, doesn't it? If you let a child, I got some thoughts here. I want to make sure we understand these thoughts. Okay, so let's fit that in. If you raise a child according to the way he wants to go, what's going to happen? If you let him choose his own friends, and what I mean by that is, with there's no criticism, there's no vetting of his friends. If you simply allow him to hang out with whomever he wishes, okay, if you let him choose his own friends, whether or not he'll eat the food that you put in front of him, whether he gets a shot, you think about it, if you let a child decide whether they're going to get a vaccination, what's the kid going to say? No way. I'm not going there. I'm not going to the doctor. I'm not going to go to the dentist. I don't want to go to the dentist. All they're going to do, if you let a child do what they want to do, when he goes to bed, if you let a kid stay up as late as they want, what are they going to do? They'll stay up. They'll never go to bed. And then what will happen? The next day it'll be even worse. It never gets better. They never say, oh, yeah, it's time for me to start going to bed at a regular hour again. They say, I'm going to do what I want to do. Yes, sir. Isn't that so? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and at the end of the day, the end results are the same whether we interject ourselves or whether we simply take a hands-off attitude. If we say, okay, you don't want to go to bed, I'm just going to encourage you, or whether I take my hands off and say, you go to bed when you want to go to bed, what are the end results? Are the end results basically the same, aren't they? Okay? Everything's going to suffer. Listen, and here's the thing. You look at some of the things that we require our children to do. Why do we require them to do them? It's not simply so we have stuff to do. I have better things to do than to wrestle my children into bed. I did that for years. I don't want to do that anymore. Okay? It's a hassle. It weighs on you. The idea, it was so nice when now we have to say, okay, go get ready for bed. They go and they know. We brush our teeth. We change our clothes. We take our makeup off. We do all of the things that we do to get ourselves ready for bed. They know what to do, and I don't have to worry about it anymore. But how did I get them to that point? I don't know how many times I'd say, okay, open up. Okay, don't bite the toothbrush. Okay, let's put a little bit more on there because they've sucked it all off. So, and I'd brush their little teeth and brush their little teeth. And finally, you got to the point where, they're brushing their own. They were able to wash their own bodies. They were able to rinse themselves off. And now I say, go get a shower. And sometimes I don't even have to say that. They don't know, okay. So they go and they get a shower. I don't have to do that anymore. Why? Because I trained them in the way that they should go. But if we do training, whether it's hands-off type of training, which is really the worst, it's really the worst kind of training there is. If we take our hands off and say, you do what you want to do, we have trained them in the way they want to go or would like to go. All right, so let's continue on. If you let him choose his own friends, whether he'll eat the food that you put in front of him or not, whether he gets a shot or not, whether he goes to bed, whether or not he does his homework, what's going to happen? What are you going to end up with? You're going to have a 10-year-old brat. You're going to have see, when they're 10, they're not quite bums yet. But boy, put 10 years on them. Put 20 years on them. And what's going to happen? You let a child do whatever they want to do, and when they're old, if you let them get away with it at 10 and you never do anything about them, you're going to have a 60-year-old brat on your hand that nobody's going to want to deal with. And that's the problem. That's the problem. And see, this is what, if parents didn't understand one thing, your child is going to be disciplined. You can either do it yourself or you can allow the state to do it. And the state is not going to hold their hand. The state is not going to encourage them. The state is not going to, sit down with them and say, listen, you're messing up your life. You're ruining your life. Don't do this. The state is going to say, guilty. You're sentenced to 5 to 10. Or it could be anything. No, I'm not going to give you a loan. No, I'm not going to hire you. No, I'm not going to do any of these things because you haven't shown you have any kind of training whatsoever. The idea of training a child, don't be late to work, or don't be late in general. What does that translate to? A worker that doesn't show up an hour late every day and lose their job because they can't be there on time. Or train a child into being diligently or scrupulous about how they treat other people's possessions. Guess what? You're not likely to have a child that's going to get arrested for putting their hand in the till. All of this goes down to the idea. That's why I wanted to talk about the idea of discipline and how important it was to God. God said it is essential. It's not just in the faith. It's just in simple, everyday things. And so we looked through history and we saw where people were not diligent in training. I keep going back to David and Absalom. Absalom was the golden child in more ways than one. And what happened? Eli and his two sons, right? They were miserable men. Took bribes. And they were just bad people. They sought bribes. They were crooked. They were corrupt. And what did that do? Was that a point of pride for Eli? Oh, and the people would come to him and say, "Your sons." How embarrassing that is for him to sit there as this man that was well respected, and to have his children constantly being brought up as a source of embarrassment because he didn't. And I'm going to take it that Eli did everything he was supposed to when they were young, but they departed. They left his instruction. They refused to keep his instruction. It could be that he was not a disciplinarian the way he needed to be, and that's why they left. If he did it correctly and they left, then it's on them. If he didn't do it and they acted incorrectly, then it's on both of them. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. Just go throughout. Look at Jacob. Did all of his sons walk uprightly? No. Again, the idea that God sees discipline as a very important thing. But we have to remember is that when we behave as parents and we do as we're supposed to do, if we train up a child in the way they're supposed to go, not as they ought to, in this verse, as they ought to go, the odds of them making it as a good person are greatly accelerated, but it is no guarantee. There's no guarantee that our children will not stray away. But what we could do is we stand back and do we have clean hands? That's really what it comes down to. Do we have clean hands? I have acquitted myself. I've done what I was supposed to do. Look at God. God disciplined his children, didn't he? How many of them are faithful? How many of them are faithful? So what I wanted to do is, this verse has put so many people in just a terrible frame of mind. They've doubted themselves. And if you have done what you're supposed to do, you don't doubt yourself. The Scripture is not saying that if you did it right, they'll never leave, or if they're not faithful, then you messed up and you've just been a parent. That's not what the verse is saying. It's actually going the opposite way. If you train up a child in the way they want to go, in their foolish, infantile mentality, then when they're older, they're not going to be happy human beings. They're certainly not going to be faithful. How many kids do you know when they're 12 or 13 say, you want to go to church? Can't wait to go to church. I'll be the first one in the car. They're 12 or 13. No, I don't want to go today. Nobody there my age. Nobody cares. I don't like my teacher, whatever it might be. And when you allow a child to determine what they're going to do, you're going to have an adult that is not going to be beholden to any kind of authority. They're not going to care. Does that make sense? Yeah. Mm-hmm. In this instance, the will and the shall are interchangeable. They're interchangeable. And remember, we got to be careful about Proverbs, because too many times we take Proverbs and we make them an absolute. Proverbs are definitely not an absolute. It means exactly what it says. When they're older, they won't. And remember, it does not mean that if a child is departed from the faith, he won't come back. I've seen plenty of people, as they get older, guess what? They get married, they have their own kids, and they realize, Mom and Dad were right. And I've seen too many people come back after being away for a while. This is talking about the idea of never instituting any kind of discipline on a child. I watched a video the other day. I watched too many of them, unfortunately. It's what I do at night, try to go to sleep. And I watched these people, and they were trying to justify their hands-off parenting. And they were they were talking about, my child, we've allowed them to kind of decide for themselves and let them figure out their own thing. Nowadays, let a child figure out what gender they are. But these people were allowing their child to kind of find their own way and express themselves and be their own person. That child was so warped. I watched him, and the kid just is. I mean, he had this. I don't know what was going on with him, but because there were no boundaries, there was nothing placed on them, and that's what this verse is saying. If you don't, well, certainly, yeah, because our children have to interact with those children. Unfortunately, they're going to be guests of the state more often than not. Because, and again, a lot of people have raised their children correctly, and they just turn out badly. They hung around with the wrong friends in spite of your best efforts. They engaged in behavior in spite of your best efforts, in spite of everything that you could do. But remember, God has never held us responsible for the actions or the crimes of another person, for the actions of another person. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Does discipline work? Yeah. And remember, discipline is not always about cracking the whip and putting your thumb down. Discipline is the best discipline that you can give your children is a good example. I mean, Christ's best example, our best lesson to us wasn't in the words that he spoke; it was in the actions that he performed, the things that he did. The words are important. Don't get me wrong, but when he was here on this earth, the greatest thing they saw was him in action, seeing the things he was doing. So when we talk about discipline, that's really the most important thing. But this is telling us that no discipline is the worst discipline. No instruction, allowing a child to do whatever they want, is going to lead to tragedy. It will. And everybody here knows at least one person has dealt with this in their lives. Yeah, and we hope we've given him the tools and the standards by which he will hold himself. There's nothing greater than to find out that after your child has left home that they continue to do what they're supposed to be doing. There's no greater feeling than that. I mean, I'm praying that that's what I experience, but you know what? I'm not guaranteed that, but I am guaranteed that if I don't do anything, then it will be tragic for them and for me. How many people have had to bury a child because the child never had limits, never was told or instructed to do something different. So I hope this makes a little bit more sense. Everybody feel a little bit better about the verse, because I've seen too many saints that I've heard men and women who cried themselves to sleep because they think of this verse and they think, what did I do wrong? You didn't necessarily do anything wrong. Remember, your children they're free moral agents. God's never usurped our free will, and He never will. Yeah. Yep. And like I said, I've known a lot of people that have been in that situation, but we don't need to look at it that way. This just tells us if we don't do anything, it's worse than making a minor mistake. To do nothing is way worse than that. Letting a child do what they want to do, because what they want to do is never going to be really what's in their best interest. You go to jail? Yeah. Yeah. And listen, a lot of parents think that they're doing their child a favor by helping them to avoid consequences for their actions. They are. They think, well, it's my child. What am I supposed to do? And sometimes one of the hardest lessons they can learn is that they have to be responsible for their own actions. They have to pay the consequences for them. And the idea of, I will help you, I'll assist you, but I'm not going to bail you out of a situation. I'm not going to go to the principal and yell at them because you saw fit to behave like a buffoon in class. I think about it. I think about Bobby being on that bus route. How many times have you seen somebody, you just think, who's raising this child? What are they, what is this kid learning at home? Heather saw it in the classroom. It's like a pack of wolves are raising these children. And when they're caught out on it, they go and they, well, my child would never do, my child didn't do this, and you just hate my child, and, anyway. That's it. All right, so we're good with Proverbs 22 and verse 6. All right, very nice. Very nice. We'll pick up again next week. We'll have another one. Pray for us as we're gone this